Hello, my name is Miriam Hall. I'm one of the lead faculty for Karuna training. And I'm here to make a recording of a podcast for you. This podcast will be talking about queerness, queer pride, and liberation, and how those connect with identity in Buddhist teachings. I'm recording this on the land of the Ho-Chunk people. I'm a white settler, cisgender, queer woman. This land is called Techope, 4 Lakes by the Ho-Chunk people. It's taking a moment to feel myself actually on this land here and feel the Ho-Chunk people still here with me. This is June of 2024, and June is Pride Month, aka Pride Month, which is short for Gay Pride Month in the United States, but some other countries in the world. And I have come to call it Queer Pride because I don't identify as gay or lesbian, to be gender correlative. And I'll say some more about queer in a moment. I wanted to take a moment to go through and look at some of the things I'm going to be talking about to define them, to help give us a sense that we're on some of the same ground. So queer is often, for an older generation of folks who are on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, often a slur, a word that was actually used against folks who were not heterosexual and cisgender. Cisgender meaning the gender that you were at birth is now the gender that you use as your identity, versus, say, transgender or non-binary. So queer, actually in the dictionary, it comes down to odd, abnormal, or peculiar. And then the connotation often involves having female qualities, but it's meant to be a slam against those who are supposed to be masculine. So he's queer, meaning that he is effeminate in ways that don't seem appropriate to his gender. But what that inherently does is also says that female qualities are a bad thing. And all of this comes out of male and straight supremacy, a sense of not just normalcy, what the norm should be, that women should be women and men should be men, what that would even mean, that everyone should be heterosexual, that everyone should marry, should have children, all of the things that sort of fit into the heteropatriarchy. But as one of my teachers, Resma Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, talks about, is that whiteness, along with these other characteristics, actually identify not just who's normal, but who's human, the supreme standard of humanness. So that when we enact homophobia or sexism or racism or all of the above, we're actually treating someone as if they're not human, which I think is really important to keep in mind. So queer at one point meant subhuman, and it's now become reclaimed as a word by some queer folks. I lead many, many different kinds of groups: contemplative writing, photography, coaching, Karuna training, all kinds of groups. And in one of my groups a while back, the participants who had been together for quite some time, one of the participants sent out an email that said, hello, fellow women. And I know that 2 of the participants identify as non-binary and use they, them pronouns, which is a given in the class. We're actually all on Zoom, so we can see the pronouns. And so I reached out to a couple of the non-binary folks and just checked in with them. Did they want me to respond? Did they want to respond? And one of them responded and said, I totally appreciate the content of what you sent and the sentiment, and I don't identify as a woman. I'm non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. And this other person was like, oh, I'm sorry. And it was a generational change. The person who had used woman is in her late 60s, and the person who identifies as non-binary is 30. But then what came back was from the person who's 30, but I think we all identify as queer. And the older woman who's cisgender said, no, I identify as lesbian. And it's not just that queer was a slander for me. This woman, actually, who's in her 60s now, was hospitalized for being a lesbian, but also that claiming lesbian is a really important part of my identity. So finally, I came down and said, I think that we can all identify as writers because we're all writers in this group. And this was a really good conversation to have. So I say that both so that we don't look at queer people as a monolith by any means, and also to understand that that term is not going to fit everybody. But I'm the narrator of this podcast, so that's the term that I'm going to use. We'll say more about that incident later when it comes to identity. So queerness, pride. I was like, well, that's not something we really need to define. You know, pride is pride. Like, be proud of yourself for being queer. And I want to dig into pride a bit. It's not that I'm opposed to being proud of being queer by any means, but I think that there are some assumptions about what that is. Pride involves being out, not hiding from the truth of who we are. And the implication is that you're out at big parades, that you're out at parties and clubs, and you're being queer in an overt way. So that shuts out people who actually are in the closet for any number of reasons. It's a completely valid way to exist. I looked at the Oxford English Dictionary because I'm a word nerd. And one definition of pride is consciousness of one's own dignity, which is, I think, a great definition. And it's kind of an internal thing, right? So we're conscious of our own dignity internally. I also really appreciate the expression a pride of lions, right? So female lions, they're together in a pride. And I think that's a pretty great vision for queer folks together. But pride itself, actually, if we think about pride comes before the fall, that use of pride can be a bit of a puffed up sense of self that's not actually connected to our dignity or integrity. In fact, in teachings on the Buddha families, 5 different families that connect in Tibetan Buddhism to the elements and to seasons and also to certain qualities of being, pride can show up as arrogance and is directly related to poverty mentality. So the more puffed up I am about myself, the less I actually feel good about myself. I'm overcompensating. So I make a big deal out of myself, but I actually think secretly that I'm not such a big deal or that I'm not good. And I don't think that's not what we want to promote. I think some of the commercialization of pride promotes that kind of view. Like, there's actually an expression in the queer world, pinkwashing, which is like sort of making someone feel better about how they appear, not based on actuality. So that's a kind of pride that I'd like us to not be proud of or work with. I'd rather aim for an internal integration or equanimity. Equanimity meaning an acceptance of who I am in terms of queerness and gender. And then collectively, I want us to work toward liberation. So a lot of the folks that I roll with in the various queer communities tend to say when the idea of pride comes up, we tend to say, no, I don't want pride. I want liberation. I want more than rights. I want more than pride. I want liberation. So what do we mean by that? Liberation is, especially in the context of Buddhist teachings, freedom from suffering, freedom from limited thoughts and behaviors. And in the context of just about everywhere else, it's freedom from oppression. So that's external liberation and then internal liberation. And the thing is that we need both. So in Buddhist contexts, people sometimes focus mainly on internal liberation. We can free our minds, and that's great. Except for that, also we live in these oppressive contexts where we also need to free each other and change the systems. When we put all of the onus on queer folks to come out, be proud that somehow we're the ones who are going to make the change, that puts a lot of weight on the people who are suffering the most. And of course, that burden most often falls on queer people, the global majority, rather than white queer folks. We actually need cisgender and and heterosexual folks to have courage. We need them to actually come out and stand up for us instead of putting the weight on queer folks to stand up for ourselves. Fundamentally, that idea of external liberation, when we realize that getting rights to and empowering the most subjugated identities. So in the case of queerness, those are, again, people of the global majority, Black and brown folks who also are queer and especially trans. When those folks actually start to access what they need, that's the key to all of our liberation. We get free together. So queer pride versus liberation. The second part of what I wanted to talk about is something quite Buddhist-y. And it's something that's often referred to as a contrast, even a paradox, living paradox, which is the difference between absolute and relative identities. I don't remember who the teacher was. I tried to find the recording. I couldn't find it. But a few years ago, an older white cisgender male Dharma teacher had a recording online that I watched that really stayed with me, where he said, people come to Buddhism generally, who's speaking generally, come for different reasons. And the three kind of layers of the reasons why they come are formal practice. Some people want to learn to meditate and are really taken with that as a practice. Some people come for community, which in this context is called Sangha. So they come for other people, they come to connect. And some people come for transcendence, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. They want a kind of liberation that gets outside of concepts. They're here for the magic. And this really helped me understand some of the tension over whether or not identities, plural identities, all different kinds of identities, matter in Buddhist groups. I have met queer Dharma teachers and even a few people, the global majority teachers, Black and brown teachers, who don't focus on identity at all, who almost never bring it up. And I've met white, straight, cisgender teachers who make room for discussions about identity and including it in the context of the work we do. So contrary to, I think, what can sometimes be popular belief, identities matter to some people more than others in terms of what's important to them and what they prioritize, not just because, I don't just talk about queerness because I'm queer. I also talk about race, even though I'm white. And normally white folks avoid it like the plague. So there are lots of different things that can become important to us that we bring into our teaching and into our study and practice. And there are things that we leave out because we don't want to deal with those things in the world, much less in our practice. It's not unusual for people in a Dharma context to come up to somebody who's, say, running a queer Dharma group or a people of the global majority Dharma group and say, but why does it matter? We don't have white Dharma groups. We don't have straight Dharma groups. Identities are not solid. A sense of self is actually something that's coming and going and constantly changing. And that's a fundamental Buddhist teaching. So then why should queer groups or any other oppressed folks need to emphasize our identity and have a special place to emphasize that? This is where absolute and relative come in. So there are actually two ways of looking at the same thing. So in terms of the kinds of things that people say about identity, absolute things that I often hear in Buddhist community are, we are all one underneath. And our identities aren't permanent, just as our self isn't permanent. So if we're all one underneath, then why do we need to focus on identity? From the point of view of the relative, our comments often like, I'm treated differently when I enter mostly white, straight, or male spaces, or I live my everyday life through these identities, so they must matter to my practice. And this is often what happens when we enter into a conversation about identities in Buddhist spaces. We've had a lot of wind in Wisconsin lately. I live in southern Wisconsin, and I've been watching some days as our trees are like bending over sideways, 20 to 40 mile per hour winds. But the clouds are moving at what seems to be a lazy pace further up in the sky. And that's helpful for me. It's helpful to remember that that's the same weather system that's going to look different at different places. I'm going to feel the wind in a different way here than at 10 or 30,000 feet. Another way to think about this is a actually really common teaching metaphor used of an elephant and in Buddhism. And if you have people who are blindfolded or unable to see, and they're touching some part of the elephant. So they're touching the elephant's leg, they're touching the elephant's tail, they're touching the flank, the trunk, the ear, all these different parts, and they're guessing what they're touching. They're going to make different guesses that won't add up to an elephant because they're only dealing with a very small micro part of the being. Versus if you're standing as a human being next to an elephant and have all of your faculties and senses and can see that it's an elephant, versus if you're up in a plane and you see a herd of elephants running on the ground and you're far enough up that they look like ants. You wouldn't even recognize that they're elephants. That's what we're talking about when we talk about absolute and relative. It's not that one is better or more right than the other, although that's where arguments tend to go. Absolute is right. That's the only thing. That's the real dharma. Or relative is right. Identities are all that matter. It's just that there are different ways of looking at the same thing. And what can help when we are focusing on the parts, when we are actually looking at identities, all of our identities, is that we keep the whole in mind. So we keep in mind this is an elephant while we're looking at all of the parts. We keep it in mind, to bring it out of metaphor and back into the discussion, that I both do hold identities like being a woman and being white and cisgender and queer, and that those matter. And at the same time, my sense of self is constantly arising and dissolving. Both can be true. So it's true for everyone that underneath, all nearly 8 billion humans are basically the same. And it's true that our differences are important, they're significant, and they impact us. It can be simultaneously true that we don't have permanent selves, and also that how we manifest and how society responds to how we manifest really flavors our experience, including in Buddhist spaces. So it's important not to bypass through the absolute and also to not get fixated on identities. And I go back to that opening story about my 2 students who were engaging around, are we all women? Are we all queer? What was good in the end is that we did find a more absolute way. Like, we backed up the identities until we could find a common ground. We found that common ground, and we still honored and recognized this is also true, that woman is not the same thing as non-binary, that queer is not the same thing as lesbian for individual people. And we could hold the space that is generally slanted in that direction, even if we don't use the same language, that a lot of us experience overlapping oppressions in that group, and that fundamentally we're all writers, and that's mainly why we're there. So then there's the question, what about gay rights, like gay marriage? Like, what rights are important, right? I mean, that's one of the ways that we, I think, measure actually in the quote unquote Western world, in democratic, again, quote unquote democratic countries. We measure liberation by the rights, how many rights or how much of our possible rights are available to us. And this is when we have to come back to an understanding that Stonewall, the original Stonewall riots, were actually looking for freedom from police. They were looking for freedom from being boxed up. Lama Rod, one of my Dharma teachers, says we actually have to be careful to not free ourselves into suffering. So freedom, when it comes in the form of rights, can actually assimilate us into suffering. It can help queer people feel more comfortable with the suffering that's being handed down to us, instead of freeing us from suffering. People often make jokes about this in the queer community in terms of marriage. We still have the same problems with marriage that straight people do. Our divorce rates are still high, etc. We're human beings just like everyone else. So that, on the one hand, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important to be able to get married, for instance. But while one group gains that right, another group continues to not have that right or loses the right. And that zero-sum game is not a game that any of us want to play. When it comes down to, I get X so that you don't get it, that doesn't actually liberate even the person who gets the right. That just gets them rights. It doesn't liberate them. So I want to really point out that distinction. because settling for rights can be actually a way that we put up with further suffering for ourselves and for others. The fruition of choosing liberation over pride, of choosing liberation over rights, is for us to actually have real dignity and pride in ourselves as we are complex human beings with many, many identities. Even if you are not queer or identify as queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual or asexual or trans or non-binary, anything on that spectrum, you still have many identities. You have many roles in your life. Can we simply be proud of ourselves, not in comparison to someone else? I'm more queer than she is, or even I'm a better queer person when I'm out of the closet than when I'm in. And instead just find this intrinsic worth, this organic worth that comes from outside of systems of identity and oppression both. One thing that can happen when we identify with a marginalized group, or when others identify us with a marginalized group, queer folks often choose whether to name it out loud, especially if they're not recognized visibly externally by being queer, like myself. There are certainly plenty of people in the world who are already going to be predetermined, especially when they're Black or brown and trans. People will already put them in a category just by seeing them. And if we can actually become more fluid with our identities, recognizing that identity itself inherently comes and goes instead of reinforcing our identity. This problematic thing of reinforcing our identity actually happens in the lesbian community, where you have cisgender women who identify as women and they were born as women, saying that transgender women don't have a right to exist, that they aren't actually women. That's a case where reinforcing their identity so that they can exclude someone else, right? They've been oppressed, they've dealt with that, and now they reinforce their identity in a defensive way. That doesn't help. So that kind of pride, which is to say reinforcing and puffing up and saying, this is what it means to be a woman and I'm a woman, is dangerous. Letting ourselves hold on to our identities, understand them, own them, but also let them come and go and let other people's identities come and go is actually inherent to queerness. Queering, being abnormal, being outside of the boxes, is liberating for everyone rather than being a very specific, tight, small, tiny box. Recently, I attended a monthly gathering with Lama Rada Owens where he said, for Pride Month, where he said that we have to remember that all appearance is drag, as in drag kings and drag queens. All appearance is drag. It's all makeup and costume. And again, that can be a way to dismiss gender and say that gender is just performance. But actually, I took it as a playful message, especially from Lama Rad, who's a Black queen. All appearance is drag. Let's play with identity, not meaning play in a dismissive way, but play as in enjoy, take pleasure in, and really be present with our identities. This reminded me of a quote that Chogyam Trungpa would often say about appearances, how things appear one way but are actually empty of that appearance, meaning the appearance is not permanent. He would say it's like makeup on space. So me talking to you right now, you listening to me or watching me, is makeup on space. It appears in a moment, you see it, you experience it, you hear it, and then it's gone. And space changes again and shows up in a different form. And that doesn't mean that we don't take space or makeup seriously. It doesn't mean that drag can be quite serious. People put a lot of energy into drag and it's beautiful. And it also comes and goes, changes all the time. So can we hold both? The absolute that we all are impermanent, we all come and go, our identities change constantly. Can we let ourselves be liberated by that and not feel like we have to double down on our identities, whether we're oppressed or not? And then can we also let ourselves really understand and find comfort and even some play and liberation in the relative, in the fact that we are in these identities this time around. Whether you believe in multiple lifetimes, this is what's happening now. I'm showing up in this body, in these clothes, makeup if you wear it. So I hope that has given you some thoughts and some space to reflect on queerness, pride, rights, and liberation. I will also be releasing a shorter recording of contemplative writing exercises for you to explore some of these on your own. So I'll guide you through some contemplative writing. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.